you'll quickly grab your slices of pizza and get settled, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at WSU. And on behalf of the Institute, I'm happy to welcome you out to our very last Coffee and Politics of the year. We are very pleased to have with us today Natalie Stroud. Natalie is the Associate Professor of Communication Studies and the Assistant Director of the Annette Strauss Institute for Civic Participation at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research focuses on how the media affects political attitudes and how political attitudes affects media use. Stroud's work on selective exposure I assume that's to media. Selective exposure has received several awards, including the Michael Foe Outstanding Article Award from the National Communications Association and the K. Kuhn Herr Award from the International Communications Association. Join me now in welcoming Professor Natalie Stroud.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here today. Thanks so much to the Foley Institute for having me and for sponsoring these sorts of dialogues and moments of conversation. I think it's really important. So I understand that some of you are here as part of a class. Can I get a show of hands who's here as part of a class? Okay, great. Well, we will make it worth your while. So today what I'd like to do is talk to you first about how media habits have changed, and the news media landscape has changed quite a bit over the past several decades. Next, I'd like to tell you about how I think it's a bit of a problem, and there are some consequences of the media environment today that I believe should concern us. Third, and my most important one, is how are we going to fix this? And it turns out to be an incredibly difficult challenge that I hope, based on my talk today, might inspire one or two of you to take a closer look at this issue in your own lives and how you might contribute to solving some of the issues that have to do with the environment in the media today. So to start with, let's look at where people turn for campaign news and information in 2000 compared to our most recent presidential election, 2012. So back in 2000, those of you who are in college right now, you were in elementary school, which just kills me to even say that. But for those of you who were in elementary school, remember back. Remember what your parents were doing when you were in the 3rd or 4th grade. Where were they going for their election news? Think back. Where were they going? What do you guess? Television? Yes, absolutely. Where else? Where else do you think? Newspaper? Absolutely. Okay, so in 2000, number 1, number 2, and number 3 sources of information were local television news, national television news, and the local newspaper. My, how things have changed. If we fast forward to 2012, local television news consumption for campaign information is down by 10%. It's now the number 2 source that people name for campaign news. National television news has not fared well, down 14%. It's now the number 4 source for news. And local newspapers, down 17%, now the number 5 source for political news and information during campaigns. Well, let's look at what is actually gained, because it's not all losses in terms of the news media. Back in 2000, cable news was the number 4 source for campaign information, and the internet, number 5. And if we look at 2012, cable news has increased by 7%. It is now the number 1 source that people mention for where they go for campaign news and information, cable news. Internet has increased dramatically, 27% since 2000. It's now the number 3 source where people turn for political news. So things have changed dramatically in our media landscape. Now these old outlets, these used to be the stalwarts of where we turn for news and information, while still popular, they have not retained the popularity that they once had. And instead, they're replaced with all sorts of different outlets that people can then select. But when people select from all of these different sources out there, it's not as though they just pick them randomly. They don't say, oh, today, let me just look at whatever source I want to look at. No, they're very strategic in terms of which sources they select. And it turns out that we can actually sort these pretty cleanly into which sources Democrats and liberals tend to select and which sources Republicans and conservatives tend to select. It's not 100% perfect. There is some variability here, but in general, Democrats and liberals are turning to different media sources and name different media sources as the most important sources for news in comparison to conservatives and Republicans. This is a behavior known as selective exposure. And selective exposure is the use of like-minded niche news. It's the selection of news that matches your political beliefs and the avoidance of that news with which you might disagree. And it turns out there's quite a bit of evidence that this happens. But selective exposure isn't alone. It brings friends. It's one pattern that's indicative of a more central human tendency in terms of how we look at information. And so the friends it brings along with it include selective judgment, perception, and memory. Selective judgment is the process by which we judge information through the lens of our political beliefs. So when we read information that matches what we believe, if we read a study that said, you're right, and that policy is the best policy out there, and here's some evidence to back that up. When we read that, we think, oh, that's great. That's awesome. Way to go. When we read that same study, except for it doesn't support what we believe, it in fact offers facts that favor the other side. Reading that story, we think, oh, that's terribly poorly designed. Their sample size is far too small. That was the wrong technique to do the analysis. This whole thing is just terribly done. So selective judgment is where we are more critical of the opposition than we are of the same sorts of facts on our own side, which is a terrible situation, I think. Selective perception is where we more readily believe information and we attend to information that matches our own beliefs and not so much the other side. Selective memory, we tend to remember things that match what we believe. So when we think back, oh, most of the studies do tend to support my side. And oh, those other studies that I happened to read that didn't, I just don't have as clear of a memory for those at all. So all of these processes actually reflect a human tendency to want to bolster our own views and dismiss the views of the opposition. And to me, I think this is really troubling. I think these patterns should be worrisome when we ask people to make political judgments in a democracy. So why should we care about this? Not only because of these patterns, but niche news actually has some consequences that are rather important. First, when people look at news that matches what they believe, they actually participate more. So if anyone ever tells you that everything to do with selective exposure is bad and we should be just trying to get rid of it altogether, you should say, oh, maybe not so fast. Because if in a democracy we want to encourage people to participate, heck, we should celebrate selective exposure. We should celebrate niche news. If you've ever watched one of those cable news programs that articulates a view you agree with, like if you are a liberal Democrat and you've watched Rachel Maddow, or conservative Republican and you've watched O'Reilly, it is super energizing. After you're done watching that, you're like, oh my gosh, I've got to go put a bumper sticker on my car and I've got to go vote because we're so right and this guy or this lady just told me we were right. Let's go. So it's very energizing and can increase political participation. But it's not without its consequences. And the consequences of niche news are political polarization and a lack of tolerance for views unlike one's own. So when people then think about the opposition, the political opposition, they're more likely to say, I'm right, they're wrong. I have a favorable view of my own side, and I have a rather unfavorable view of the opposition. So I would argue to you, although there are some merits of selective exposure and all of these other processes, increasing political participation being a primary one, there are also a lot of negative consequences. People judging the other side more harshly than their own side. People developing more polarized political attitudes. And so for me, I would like to figure out, what can we do? Is there anything we can do to try to encourage people to A, look at views unlike their own, and B, give them a charitable rendering? At least think of them in the same manner, with the same level of criticism that you would give your own side. Be more charitable to views unlike your own. So I've been trying a series of different studies and experiments trying to address exactly this question, and I'm going to share those with you today. I will preview by saying some of these did not work out as I intended, as I had hoped, although I have a few moments of success to share with you. So the first and most popular recommendation for what we should do is we should tell everyone to look at the other side. So for those of you in the audience that like Fox News or like any form of conservative media, the prescription here is flip over to MSNBC or pick up a copy of the New York Times. And for those of you who like MSNBC and New York Times, the recommendation is, hey, why don't you check out the Wall Street Journal and why don't you flip over to Fox News? Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times has this quotation that I just think perfectly captures this. So he says, "Perhaps the only way forward is for each of us to struggle on our own to work out intellectually with sparring partners whose views we deplore. Think of it as a daily mental workout analogous to a trip to the gym. If you don't work up a sweat, it doesn't count." Now, excuse me while I go and read the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. So this is one person's recommendation, but what do you think? Would it work? If all of a sudden, everyone in the United States that primarily focuses their news diet on one side of the coin, today, we said, let's start it today, Foley Institute, plan, everyone look at the other side. What do you think would happen? Who's going to be brave? What do you think is going to happen?
My guess would be that if people look at the source they disagree with, they might react so strongly that they will write off that source in the future and go back to what they prefer.
Beautifully stated. They might look at it, write it off so strongly, and go back to the source that they prefer. In fact, it might have exactly the opposite consequence of what we wanted. It might lead people to polarize even more because they're so mad about what they saw, or because they find it so preposterous and kind of funny to look at the other side. Many people might have had an experience like that, where they looked at a view unlike their own. So I don't think this is the right solution. I do not think this is going to work. Next idea, perhaps it's knowledge. I'm an educator. I teach at the University of Texas. I really hope that there's something that happens when we talk to our students about politics, when we teach them about what's going on in the broader world of policy and government and media. And so my idea here is maybe the solution is knowledge. If we give people a lot of political facts, perhaps then they will be more likely to look at the other side and to give it a charitable rendering. I couldn't have been more wrong, and this is one of my professional disappointments, because I want knowledge transmission. I want education to be the answer. But what happens is the more politically knowledgeable people are, it's not always true that they look at the other side more. So really quickly, pop quiz for you. Not really, but your instructor will back me up. This is not really a pop quiz, but very quickly for you. Who's vice president of the U.S.? Which party has majority in the U.S. Senate? What job does John Boehner hold? Who's Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? Very good. You guys are good. All of them correct. Perfect, perfect. So excellent for you. But before you celebrate, these are the exact sorts of questions that we ask people to find out how politically knowledgeable are you. And what we want to find out is, are the politically knowledgeable more likely to look at the other side and give it a charitable interpretation? And totally, you're not. So the more of those questions you answered correctly, you're actually more likely, statistically, to look at your own side, not look at the political opposition. So this one is really disappointing because it suggests that in my classes, when I talk to students and I tell them all sorts of political information, what I might be doing is actually increasing the chances that they go out and do the behavior that I don't want them to do, which should make us really nervous. And it makes this problem all the more fun to try to think about. How can we solve this? What can we possibly do? Well, maybe thinking about political knowledge with questions like, who's the vice president? Maybe that's not the best measure. You know, that's pretty general. Who knows what we're measuring there? So another possibility that we've tried is to tell people to look for signs of bias. So we might actually tell people, we're going to give you an article or you're going to watch a program, and we want you to be on the lookout for signs of bias. So when you read it or when you watch it, really carefully look for signs of bias. You might see bias on the left, you might see bias on the right, and afterward we'll ask you about it. So what we do is we randomly ask half of the people to look for signs of bias without telling them anything beforehand. We say, just read this article or look at this program. For the other half, we give them this cautionary note ahead of time. And this cautionary note is something that you often get in introductory critical thinking textbooks. Those of you who are students here, show of hands, did any of you take kind of an introduction critical thinking class or something along those lines here? No? Okay. No worries. I don't think we offer one at University of Texas either, but where I did part of my undergraduate, they did offer this sort of class. And so you would read this textbook that would tell you, here's an argument fallacy, and here's how you might detect it. And when they were talking about the media, they would say things like, when you look at the media, be on the lookout for signs of bias. And that was what they told you. So we're essentially putting that to the test. If we tell people to be on the lookout for signs of bias, will it in fact improve their ability to detect biases? Will it lead people to see biases both against themselves and in their favor? What do you think happened here? Who wants to be brave and give a prediction? It's a total guess, so you can't be wrong. What do you think?
There's a bias only in the opposition's point of view, if it supports that.
There's a bias only in favor of the opposition. You couldn't be more correct. So this strategy does not seem to help. It doesn't seem to make people more apt to detect biases. And if anything, it makes things worse in exactly the direction that you propose, which is that people then become even more capable of detecting biases that are against them. They're like, oh my gosh, that Fox News, it's really biased. Or that MSNBC, so biased. But then the channel that matches them, or the information that's in their favor, we seem to have so much trouble in detecting biases that actually favor ourselves, even though it's really easy and quick for us to detect biases that are against our beliefs. So far, I'm telling you a bit of a string of failures here. Things just don't seem to be working too well for me. So next idea we tried is, does this guy have the answer? Here's the theory. What we have found in lots of social science research has found this, is that when people are looking at comedic programming, they're less apt to process it in a partisan manner. So even if the joke is against you, think about last time you heard a political joke, you still might kind of find it funny, right? Even if it's kind of poking fun at your political view, you can still kind of laugh a little bit. We're talking about 2000 before. If you saw a joke in 2000 about Bush not being the smartest guy, you could still laugh if you like Bush. And if you saw a joke about Al Gore being a little stiff, you could still laugh at that. So if people are somehow inhibited from processing comedy through the partisan lens, so they process comedy and laugh at it irrespective of their partisanship, maybe we could create some way for them to select political comedy that is counter to whatever their beliefs might happen to be. So we set up this study, and for half of the people, they were asked to surf a news website that included articles both on the left and on the right, and all of these articles were in fact serious in tone. Another website, identical in almost every manner but one, it was actually funny. So we pulled the same article content and tried to make it funny. So we created a funny and non-funny version of a whole bunch of different articles. Very fun work for the undergraduate students that helped with this, who are far funnier than I am. They were able to pull from folks like Stewart and folks like Colbert and comedy programs across the political spectrum to put together these funny versions. We then created the serious versions. It turns out academics are really good at making funny things serious. So that was actually not that hard. So we have the funny version and the serious version. People browse these websites, and we're tracking their behavior. For the funny one, how often do they click on articles that match their views? For the serious one, how often do they click on articles that match their views? And what I'd really hoped to see here, is that comedy would inhibit the selection of like-minded information. That when everything is presented in a little bit of a funny manner, people might be likely to actually look at the other side and say, hey, I can give it a fair shot. I can laugh at myself a little bit. Who would like to be brave now? What do you think happened here? Did comedy inhibit selective exposure? Did those people in this funny condition over here click on articles that were funny but didn't match their beliefs? They kind of made fun of themselves. What do you think? Who's going to be our brave one now? Are you going to be brave again? Great, double brave. Bonus points from your instructor. Oh, no! Oh, you're showing up the students. Okay. Yes, it totally did not work. It did not work at all. And I was so optimistic. Wouldn't it have been fun if I could stand up here and say, go access comedy. You'll be able to look at other views, and it actually seems to get you to look at the other side and give it a charitable rendering. No, it did not work that way. A, people were even more likely to click on views that matched their own with the comedy, and B, they became less tolerant to the other side in the comedic condition versus the other. Total failure. Do not look at comedy is the consequence of this study. It doesn't seem to inhibit some of these patterns of selective exposure. Next question. So I really wanted to come up with some solution that could be real world in nature, that we could really try to get people to look at different views in a way that could actually be used on websites, for example, or used in newsrooms. And so we came up with this idea that we're calling the Engaging News Project. We were fortunate enough to have the Democracy Fund believe a little bit in this vision and fund our initial phase of research. And here's our pitch. See what you think of our pitch. Our pitch is this. We would like to find ways of engaging audiences in A, commercially viable, and B, democratically beneficial manners. So what we think of in terms of democratically beneficial are these sorts of interventions that will encourage people to look at the other side, to inhibit their selective exposure, to inhibit selective perception. Any way we can encourage people to look at the other view and think about it in a more mindful and charitable manner. For the commercially viable aspect of this, we said, let's actually talk to news websites and find things that they will actually use. Because so often in academic research, we come up with things that might work, but it's in a lab where you're kind of hooked up to different things. And you're asked to read these really long paragraphs where it's not quite clear what the real-world application might happen to be. So this was an attempt to do something in the real world that could actually work. And so commercial viability would be a sell to companies that this would increase the amount of time people spend on the site, for example. This would increase the number of clicks that people have on a site. So for those of you who are communication or political science folks, if you're interested in any sort of news or getting involved in web affairs, these are the sorts of metrics that are the end-all, be-all of news corporations. So that's what we're looking at, and we came up with a series of different interventions trying to meet this goal. The first goal, or the first idea we had, is to look at the prompts that we place before hyperlinks on news websites. So I pulled this from your own news organization here, and you'll notice interesting things about this site. The first thing that you might notice is that in the corner here, what they're doing is they're organizing hyperlinks for you, the site visitor, to try to encourage your use of different hyperlinks. The most common way that websites today do this is by organizing hyperlinks into the most viewed, most commented, or most liked, exactly what I found on your local news site here. But a lot of this is just trying to get people to click on things. Is there a more productive way that we could categorize hyperlinks to try to encourage people to click on a link that might not totally match their view? And so we first did a look at all sorts of different websites out there. What are they actually doing? What sorts of prompts do they use in addition to this most viewed, most commented? And one of my favorites comes to us courtesy of the Washington Post. The Washington Post actually categorizes their columnists into left-leaning and right-leaning columnists. As soon as I see this, I think, oh my goodness, they're basically signposting selective exposure. They're basically telling you, hey, if you lean left, click here. If you lean right, click here, and we'll make it easy for you. They tell me that that has worked very well for them. And then on the pages, here's how they try to encourage you to think about another view. They'll say things like, disagree with the opinions here, check out our left-leaning opinions, and then include a hyperlink right there, basically facilitating your selective exposure even more. So when I saw this, I thought, is there a better way? Is there some other way that we could use these hyperlink prompts to encourage people to look at alternative views? So what we decided to do is to create a website that articulated one political point of view. And the way we designed the study, everyone actually got to see an article that first matched whatever they believed. And then it just so happened, on this sheet that they were looking at, that we included a set of hyperlinks in the corner and at the bottom. And one of those hyperlinks just so happened to be a link to the alternative point of view. So we could see how likely are people to click on a hyperlink that brings them to the other perspective. And then the only thing that we varied is what the prompt was before those hyperlinks. So could we find some sort of language that would encourage people to click on the link to the alternative perspective? So we tested about 6 different prompts here. The one included here is form accurate opinions by reading different viewpoints. So it just seemed that enough to get people to say, okay, maybe I'll click on that other side. Maybe I'll see what they're saying over there. Our results on this never turned up having both an argument on a journalistic side and an argument on the business side. Again, we tested 6 different prompts like this, trying to encourage people to look at the other side. For the accuracy goal, which said form accurate opinions by reading different viewpoints, here people were more likely to see their own arguments as weaker and the opposition's arguments as stronger. So some democratic benefit from reading this. People tend to evaluate their own beliefs just a little bit weaker, and the opposition's is just a little bit stronger. So a tiny bit of depolarization is a consequence of having this one small change on the website. But we couldn't sell it to news organizations. There were absolutely no business implications here. Didn't change time on site. Didn't change number of clicks. So a tougher sell, but our most promising of any of the prompts that we evaluated. Another one that we tested is called self-affirmation. And there's this theory that if you feel good about yourself, if you think, things are going well and I have strong self-esteem today, that you'll be more likely to click on a view unlike your own. And so for self-affirmation, we said, thanks for keeping up with the news. Be proud of protecting your democracy, to try to get people to think, oh, wow, I'm doing pretty good here. I feel good about myself because I'm looking at the news. And there had been previous literature in psychology that suggested this might have some beneficial effects. It totally did not. Yes, people who received this prompt spent less time with our entertaining articles, but they also saw their own views as more legitimate, exactly the opposite of what we were trying to encourage. And it makes sense, right? If you have one of those days where you're like, oh, I'm doing great today. I looked at the news, everything is going great. And then I say, how legitimate do you think your views are? You're probably going to say, super legitimate. That other side, I don't know what they're talking about. And that's exactly what we saw here. Business implication, the site was seen as slightly more credible. I think, again, this is just kind of a positive effect that translated into everything. My views are great. This site is great. The day is great. And so it didn't really have any of the effects that we had hoped. And it had fewer clicks on hyperlinks. This definitely was not going to be a winning proposition either from a democratic angle or a business angle. So of the 6 we tested, I have another sob story for you. None of them came out with a solution that we would say, yes, newsrooms should employ this. What we do say, however, is newsrooms should be so cautious. These small wording changes have an effect. They change people's behaviors. They change people's attitudes. And if you're the Washington Post just willy-nilly putting things up there, you should be really, really careful. It has effects. Okay, next one. Next idea is looking at polls and quizzes. Turns out that polls and quizzes can be helpful, but it turns out that right now how they're designed on news websites isn't so ideal. So here's one actually on your local news site here. And what it does is it asks people with the recent events that took place in Boston and Texas, how are you coping with the tragic news? And if you click on it, you get this result here. Those of you who are students here, or anyone, of course, I'll open it up to everyone. What do you think of this poll? Is this the bastion of social science? Should we base our policy decisions on the basis of this poll? I hear some no's. Why not? Why not? It's on your local news website. Why not? Nice. Absolutely not enough information. I have no idea who took this poll. It could have been 3 people in the newsroom. I have no idea. It doesn't even tell us how many people took it. It's total junk. I gotta be honest. It's junk. And if you talk to newsrooms and ask them about putting this on their site, they'll admit it. It's junk. It doesn't have any democratic purpose. People should not rely on the information. The only reason it's there is because it increases time on page and number of clicks. And so what we said is, can we somehow switch this up? Can we encourage news sites, instead of using junk, to use something more productive? that will get people to think about the other side, what other people might think, and give some rationales for other views. So we've proposed not only content changes, but format changes. Content changes, don't make it about junk topics. Make it about actual public affairs topics, and make it about factual information. So here, take the results of an actual public opinion poll and ask people to make a guess. Here, what percentage of Americans say the 2010 healthcare law recently upheld by the Supreme Court will make things better for them? It's still engaging, and you get real data that you can rely upon when you click the answer and get information back. We also have proposed format changes. So instead of the multiple choice exam that you all are intimately familiar with, why not make it a little bit newer, a little bit more engaging? What about a slider poll that then gives people the whole range of options from 0 to 100, and it's novel. People like to play with it. So we tested this in the lab, and it turns out that using this format increases people's learning, increases time on site, they enjoy it more. So for many reasons, we think that this is a way that at least we can give people some facts that they will remember, that selective judgment and selective memory won't come into play. We found no partisan differences across several issues that we did using this method. So we think this is our one. You will notice I've told a sad story to this point. Yay, I have a little bit of a happy moment. I think that news organizations can use this to do at least a little something. Second idea is to look at buttons, or third idea in this series. And what we note is that whenever you look on any page that has a comment section, or even on your Facebook pages, the thing that you always are invited to press is like, right? Do you like this? Do you like that? But like really engenders a black and white partisan take on the world, right? Do you like that perspective? Are you really going to hit like for a political view unlike your own? Imagine what your friends would say if you hit like for the political candidate that you disagreed with. They would probably write on your wall like, has your Facebook page been hacked? What's wrong? Is everything okay? Have you had a change of political identity? So we think that this term like is actually really problematic because it does exactly the thing that we don't want. Encourages people to think about posts in terms of their political identity. So we've instead been testing what happens if the only thing we change is we use respect instead of like. And in all of our lab tests, what we found is people are far more likely to respect the other side when they wouldn't like it. So again, small steps, but I think steps in the right direction. So my summary for you is that there are things we can do. No one solution will fix all of our social ills. Problems like selective exposure and selective judgment are huge, and they're deeply ingrained in our human psychology. This isn't something tomorrow that we're going to wake up and say, oh, I'm going to be unbiased information consumers, check out both sides, and I'm going to be perfectly careful in terms of adjudicating the arguments fairly. It's going to take a lot of small steps like this. So my challenge to you is, what are you going to do? What innovations can you come up with to try to address this issue? So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing any questions or ideas that you might have.
So we have 10 or 15 minutes for questions.
What are the parallels between this type of behavior and those of addiction?
Interesting. I had never considered the parallels between this and addiction. They have shown that there are some sorts of addictive behavior, like, for example, as an election is approaching, people tend to consume news at almost an addictive level. I don't know how much that would explain people's tendency to look at information that matches what they believe, in the sense that I think part of what really motivates that selection is we're actually not so cognizant in some situations that we're even doing it. And I think for addiction, at least for some of the later stages of that, people are aware of what they're doing, whereas that's not always the case here. But it's a really interesting parallel. I hadn't thought of it before. I'll have to think more deeply on that. Thoughts, questions, ideas?
Is part of the answer just encouraging people to go to mainstream news sites that still say that Nancy Pelosi says this and John Boehner says this? Is it that simple?
potentially could be part of it. The tricky part is there's something really catchy about these partisan programs. And when they've done research giving people, here's the partisan program with people that are kind of yelling at each other and it's kind of engaging, people actually prefer that. So I think that there is a component of let's get people to go back, but I think the old model doesn't work. And if you look at national news over the past several decades, it really hasn't changed that much. I mean, the sound bites have become shorter, it's a little bit faster paced, but they really should be thinking about innovation to try to get people to go back to this form of news because they're losing right now. Yeah. Yeah.
Does the newspaper media have, or I guess the media in general, and I think the newspaper specifically, have any responsibility when a commentator that they're carrying a comment, and I'm not saying, but I just use him as a conservative, makes a false statement in his commentary or her commentary?
In terms of audience reaction, they can. So if the audience is upset enough to not watch the channel or not renew their subscription to it, then there is a clear consequence. But it's not as though there's a law that says now you have to go out of business or something along those lines. There is an ethics about it. I mean, there are organizations that regularly post corrections or try to fix that. But it's really, really a tough thing because how many times, let's just do a poll, how many of you have opened up your daily newspaper and turned to the corrections and actually read them on any day? Maybe 10% or so. So I think it's a tough business because how do you actually correct that? But there's an ethics to it, and we've seen major cases where people have been let go for falsifying stories, for example, to try to retain the credibility of the outlet. I'm thinking of the New York Times, for example. But there's no law, and I doubt there would be because it would infringe upon freedom of the press. Yeah. Pardon? Who masterminded the like button in the first place?
No, like you said that in your experiment, but respect buttons.
Myself and my team came up with the idea of doing respect instead. There have been other people that have proposed changes to that button, but their changes have been more about saying important, for example, instead of like. So the concern that others have expressed in the past is that the like button, do you actually check that if something terrible has happened? Like when everything was going on in Boston, and they were saying, we're going after these two, there's a big manhunt, shelter in place. Do you actually like that story? That's a bit of an uncomfortable thing to put. Or if someone announces bad news on Facebook, maybe any of you have had the experience where you hit like, and you're like, wait, I don't like it. I've got to explain myself. I don't mean like. So folks have proposed changes to that button in the past, but we have introduced the respect button as a new way to try to minimize some of these partisan reactions.
So much of our discussion today has assumed that selective exposure actually causes more polarization.
Yes.
But there's a big empirical debate about that, whether or not it's causing polarization or reflecting polarization. So how would you characterize the state of that debate? Is there a more clear answer emerging, you think?
So you will hear much more at the discussion this afternoon. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Okay. I will announce that at the end.
Okay, perfect. I will say my own view is that I believe there is clear evidence that the media, that watching partisan media can lead people to more polarized political attitudes. I've seen that in all sorts of studies using different approaches and designs that I find to be quite persuasive. And I think that it has a strong theoretical base for why that should happen. Just think about your own behavior or think about your own attitudes. When you're watching something or when you're in a group or when you are hearing something that really matches what you believe, but that's maybe a little bit more extreme than you, the tendency is to then become a little bit more extreme yourself, and that's been shown in study after study after study. So I find it rather persuasive. Some folks this afternoon are going to disagree, which will be great fun, so I encourage all of you to come.
So, thinking about the respect button or changing design or algorithms or whatever for democratic benefit, how do we translate that research that we find that works into actual practice? Like, how do you get Facebook to change the word like? It's so embedded in their brand. So, is there hope?
Thank you so much for this. Facebook, who knows? I'm happy to take my cause there. I do think that there are ways that we can start to make these changes. So for those projects that I shared with you as part of the Engaging News project that were successful, so for both the polls and for the respect button, we've been working to partner with different sites that would be interested in testing it on their site. And so we do have a site that will put that on their site at some point in the discussion section. And so we're actually working on a WordPress code that then any site that wanted to use it could then access that and use it on their site. So this would be, in a sense, some competition for Facebook. Let's all cross our fingers that that might have some success, but thank you for that question. I mean, it's tough. Any of these are tough. You have to start somewhere, though, and so I think this is at least a start.
Have you done any research on Twitter?
Oh, great question. I have not done any research on Twitter personally, but I have some colleagues, most notably Devon Shaw at the University of Wisconsin, that has done some research on Twitter. And the interesting finding, of course, from my perspective, being biased and engaging in selective exposure and remembering things that match what I believe, was that he did find clusters of people tweeting based on their political identity. So he found a very clear conservative Republican cluster of people who were tweeting to one another and a very clear Democratic liberal cluster of people who were tweeting to one another. So that would be a great resource for you if you're interested in seeing more. He's also got a fantastic graph of it showing who tweets to whom. So I would recommend looking that up. Oh, great question. Complicated answer in some ways. So in my analysis that I've done, I've examined whether or not it differs across age groups. And there was not a statistically significant difference across age groups. So different age groups were equally likely to do this. But there are differences in terms of the media consumption patterns, where those people who are older are more likely to look at newspapers or look at television. Those people who are younger are more likely to turn to the internet, for example. So the medium matters. But I actually think that this is a more pervasive cross-age sort of pattern that we see happening in the United States.
So, what I listening to you speak to here is this, is change.
Mm-hmm.
And those of us who know the mind know that you never want to do something incorrectly the first time, and then suddenly be asked to change it a short time afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 30, 40 years, maybe 10 centuries. Once it's in, it's very difficult to get it out and replace it with, as a three-step mind-blowing change. And this is confirmation in my mind. I think confirmation of what we're dealing with, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's broccoli at the age of
Right.
or learning who your president is. It seems to fall back to that list.
I agree. There is something very broccoli-ish about this sort of pattern, and it is something that once you believe a certain piece of information, for example, it takes a lot to get someone to change that belief. So for people who believe, for example, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, it takes a lot for people to change that belief once it's been embedded. It's not impossible, though. So there are studies that suggest that if you repeatedly receive the correct information, at some point you do adopt the correct information. But I agree, the challenge is immense for exactly the reason that you articulate.
Time for one more question.
Have you guys done anything about seeing the kind of trafficking on conglomeration sites like Google News, for example? It's not like reporters that work for Google or anything. They just kind of be like, hey, here's some keywords that relate to your search. Pull these articles and then go. I mean, personally, that's how I get my news. I just don't want to go to one side or the other.
Couple of reactions to that. One is we did do a study where we examined whether or not the labels of the story, so whether the story was from Fox News or CNN, affected people's browsing habits, even in Google News. Found some evidence that they did. The second thing is a wonderful book by Eli Pariser called Filter Bubble, which I completely recommend getting, suggests that these algorithms actually learn where we click over time. And then it presents us with information based on our previous click habits. So if you're constantly picking out stories that match a certain political belief or are on certain issues, the algorithm is learning you so that in the future you might not even realize it, but your search might look quite different than someone else's. And then it's basically forcing selective exposure on you by changing your search results. So be alert to that. Check out what other people's Google News feeds look like when you're searching for your next topic.
Okay, well, unfortunately our time is up. It's been a really interesting presentation. For those of you who want to know more about media and politics, we have a symposium this evening from 4 to 5:30. It will be in the room right next door here, looking at the role of media and political polarization. And we have Natalie will be on that panel as well. We've got 2 other scholars who will be on that panel. One other quick announcement. Those of you who may be here for a class, there will be some sign-up sheets down the hall, at the end of the hall here on your way out. Otherwise, join me now in thanking Natalie Stroud for a really interesting